The death of the ESG committee. Climate change is forcing fundamental change for organizations. Indeed, in many cases transforming the entity's business model. The role of governance in enabling and guiding the transition to the net zero economy has never been more important. I'm thrilled to welcome Vicky Moffatt to the Better Boards podcast series. Vicky is Chief Executive Officer of Chapter Zero, the Directors Climate Forum. She's also an advisor to a FTSE 100 board and on the advisory council of the Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator. A warm welcome to the Better Boards podcast series. I'm Dr. Sabine Demkowski, founder and managing partner of Better Boards. We make the boards of the most ambitious organizations more effective. Our mission at Better Boards is to contribute to creating better boards. We do this by providing clients with an evidence-based approach to board evaluations and development programs. We have created an innovative board evaluation platform organizations can access and use to conduct their board evaluation, be it the internal one or the external one. And we also work with leading professional service organizations who use our platform. To fulfill our mission, we give a voice to all who care about creating better boards. Vicky, thank you so much for making time for us and contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Vicky, in the last 2 years, you spent a lot of time in boardrooms, a lot of time, focusing on discussions about climate change. Can you maybe provide us with some insights of what you experienced and what you have seen?
Yes, well, thank you. Well, maybe first I'll tell you what Chapter Zero is so you can understand where my thinking is coming from. So Chapter Zero is the Directors Climate Forum, and it was co-founded 4 years ago by NEDs for NEDs. And since then, we've had this extraordinary growth around the world where Chapter Zero now has 32 chapters in 73 countries around the world that have grown in just 2 or 3 years, led by our partners at the Climate Governance Initiative in partnership with the World Economic Forum. So we're a membership organisation for non-execs and chairs, and we focus on climate, as you said. We are philanthropically funded, and our purpose is to equip and inspire directors to lead on climate from the boardroom. And we work with the FTSE 350 group, where we have 80% penetration in FTSE 100 businesses. But we work broadly with all sorts of directors from different sizes of organisations, some of whom are at the very beginning of the climate transition, and some of whom are very advanced, and everything in between. So what I've been doing for these last 2 years is being involved in discussions, in masterclasses, events, and creating climate briefings, all with a view to getting directors to lead on climate from the boardroom. So to go back to your questions, what are some of the trends and insights, things that we're hearing and seeing? Although every director is at a different place in their journey, what we need to happen is that every director understands that over the longer term, there are only 2 scenarios for the transition and for our global economies. The first scenario is that we invest the capital investment required to get us to the clean energy system. And that's estimated at about $3 trillion a year of capital investment by 2030 globally. And that's what we hope is happening and will happen. But the second scenario is that we do not achieve that, in which case we risk runaway climate change. And looking at the Climate Action Tracker estimates, currently, when we think about real world action based on current policies, we're looking at a 2.7 degree scenario. So we do have a huge task ahead, and the role of directors in leading this transition is absolutely fundamental. Just to quantify the size of the challenge, many of you may have seen the UN Environment Programme report that was released just ahead of COP28 last year, and it talked about a possible hellish 3 degrees of global warming, and that to get on track for 1.5, we need to target a reduction of global emissions by 42%. So just think about that. We're talking 42% of global emissions. That is equivalent to the output of the world's 5 worst polluters: China, US, India, Russia, and Japan.
Vicky, I mean, these figures are very clear. The figures are well publicized. And yet, I don't know about you, and I hope we go into this a little bit. I feel a certain tiredness in boardrooms on this topic. It doesn't seem to be as high a priority anymore as it used to be maybe 18 months ago, yeah, 24 months ago. What's your feeling? What's your sense?
It's a fascinating time we're in, and there are headwinds and tailwinds. And I think in some boardrooms, we are seeing perhaps more inertia than we would like. But actually, different boards and different directors as individuals are in different places. So there's a lot of diversity and polarity. Thinking about headwinds, obviously, we're still facing the ESG backlash, largely led in the US. We are in a time of 64 elections around the world, so a fragile kind of policy context. We're talking in Chapter Zero about sort of metaphorically mending the fishing nets as we wait for government policy. There are economic uncertainties, obviously, a changing geopolitical context that brings more and more uncertainty. So you're right in one sense that the headwinds are making climate more and more difficult to move forward with. But let's talk about tailwinds. Regulation is moving fast and is becoming a real lever for change. I think particularly the work of CSRD in Europe is very far ahead. CSRD includes a double materiality perspective, which I might come on to later. Here in the UK, transition planning is moving things forward very quickly. And for those of you not familiar with it, it was an HM Treasury task force that was put together for UK leadership on creating a strategic business plan that actually transitions businesses and entities towards a clean green economy. And what's exciting about transition planning as a regulatory lever is that it actually has a real focus on governance, with more focus than perhaps other former regulatory regimes. And it is a forward looking requirement. Depending on which way you look at this, Sabine, the insurance industry is becoming more and more important, whether it's carrot or stick, because actually, many are talking about some of the impacts of climate change becoming uninsurable. And risk committees and audit and risk committees are thinking hard about the impacts, whether that's a tailwind or a headwind, you can decide. But actually, I think the longer term nature of the net zero transition makes it fall in perfect alignment with the very role of the board itself. And actually, if you look at the corporate governance code, the role of the board is to promote the long term sustainable success of the company, to generate value for shareholders, and to contribute to wider society. So if you look at that definition and you look at the project of net zero, these are perfect bedfellows. First, when I came in, I thought, right, well, the job is to change the mindset of the individual director so that they understand the new world that we're living and working in. And actually, we worked with our Global Insights partner, Kantar, on that concept of the NED mindset shift. And what we found was actually, no, it's not about the individual director, it's about shifting the very culture of the boardroom itself.
We entitled this podcast rather provocatively, The Death of the ESG Committee. Can you tell us about what motivated you to give this title?
It's very interesting because obviously ESG committees can be hugely important in driving change around business model and strategy. But actually, the point is that the further you go, the more you realize that climate and sustainability are issues for every board committee and indeed for the whole board. And I think that's the point of my provocative title. Spencer Stewart, in their board index, found in the recent survey that only 37% of boards have ESG committees. And there are arguments for and against putting them together. I would suggest that actually for a board that's at in an early place in terms of the net zero transition and how it impacts business strategy, an ESG committee would be a very good idea. But if you think about it, let's go through some of the other committees. Let's think about audit and risk, because only 17% of boards, according to Spencer Stuart, have a dedicated risk committee. But I was at a conference not too long ago where the CFO of NatWest, Katie Murray, was there. And she said a thing I haven't forgotten, which is that the CFOs of the future need to be as adept at managing the carbon budget as they do the financial budget. And, in the same vein, the audit and risk committee need to be thinking about managing that carbon budget now, not just that financial budget, and particularly with a double materiality lens. Think of REM, LTIPs, thinking about performance bonuses, the soft measures, and how all of that's set up. And then nomination committees. Actually, what is a climate competent NED? How do you find them? Questions around board composition. Something that Chapter Zero did actually before I joined was quite pioneering, putting together a declaration of global search firms, a commitment from Chapter Zero that said we sign up to a pledge to put climate competent directors on boards. And interestingly, over the last 2 years, that now has 22 signatories from large global search firms. And right now at Chapter Zero, we're putting together the next phase of that project, which actually looks to define what is climate competency for directors.
Let me jump in there, Vicky, because in almost every board evaluation, of course, we look at the composition of boards as part of the board evaluation. And there we see a huge perceived gap in terms of most people think climate and ESG and the environment is very important. Yeah. So they give it a high rating there. But they don't think that the know how is as developed as it should be. I know that Chapter Zero has done a lot in terms of educating non executive directors, but I have not evaluated a board who is entirely happy with the knowledge in this area.
Well, I hate to say this, but I think this is something that to some degree we need to almost get comfortable with. I don't mean that in a negative sense, but I think that we're talking about fundamental systemic change. And I think the levels of sort of intimidation that perhaps you're referring to are there. There is a sense that this work is too difficult or very difficult. But I think, as Amanda Blunt said, who's chair of the TPT, the job is to get started. The job is to jump in and start learning. And that's bigger than the knowledge of an individual director or even a CEO or anybody in any organization. I think all of us across the system are learning. But the point is, we have to get going. And I was very interested in Kingfisher's net zero strategy, which builds in 4 years to test EV batteries. And I think that's an example of best practice. And I think what we need to do is to build in these testing periods with the impact KPIs to learn as we go in the way that innovation's always been approached inside boardrooms and excos. So, we have to encourage each other. And I think one of the reasons that Chapter Zero has had this wonderful response is that, NEDs like to help each other, to talk to each other.
Yeah.
The issues they're dealing with are not ones they can speak about very often or very openly. And under the Chatham House rule, there's real value in the peer-to-peer conversation and the encouragement. I mean, we had an ESG committee chairs dialogue, a webinar this morning, and just to bring it to life, one director was saying, "Oh, I feel like I'm a policewoman. The board think of me as ticking the compliance or regulatory box." And there were other people in the room, encouraging that director and saying, "Well, you're not, and go further." So there's that sort of moral support. But actually, I think the other thing is the ability, and I'm very proud of what we try to do at Chapter Zero in terms of curating across, what should a director be reading, and helping them say, well, these, if you read only 5 things, read these, or if you want a briefing on a topic, we have it for you. Because working across all sorts of partners across the system, there's real expertise out there,
Absolutely.
actually, but many organizations are not translating that expertise for this this audience. And I think that's where the value comes in.
Our listeners are always interested. So, what are the organizations doing that get it right? Let's talk a little bit about that. What are good examples of boards and organizations who do get it right? You mentioned already one or two examples, but please give us some more on this front.
Yes. The first thing which would give you the sort of A to Z is I'd highly recommend, if you're looking for case studies of what good looks like, go to the Transition Planning Task Force website, where there are some fantastic case studies that have been carefully vetted, including videos, examples, all sorts of great work has happened there. And actually, Julie Badley, our chair at Chapter Zero, has been chairing one of the task force there, as well as some of the other advisors here at Chapter Zero. So that's just a good place to go. But I want to just bring to life the topic of the fact that climate is a full board issue with a few examples from our membership that I've collected for you, Sabine. So
Fantastic. Thank you.
so one is a director on the board of an airport authority. And this is really interesting that actually there is a nominated director in that board for oversight of climate. But guess what? They're not sitting in the ESG committee. And I thought that was very interesting. So there is a separate ESG committee in that boardroom, but the director responsible for climate doesn't sit in it. They, in fact, sit in the audit committee. So that's an example of really maturing and really thinking about this as a whole board issue and how you might do that. Second example is actually a director on the board of an energy sector company. And what they did at board level was they said, no business case can come to the board unless it includes a sustainability and climate aspect to it. And that was mandatory. And again, that director was saying, well, what we hope is that we don't have to ask for that in future, but that's a mechanism to actually force this across the whole board agenda and make sure that every Exco business case that is brought to the board has that in it. And then a third example is an FMCG board where actually the CFO was sitting within the ESG committee itself in two different boards, one as an attendee in more listening capacity and one as more of an active participant. And I think what these things illustrate, which is really interesting, is actually that the role of the board itself is slightly changing because of the climate agenda, where the board is simultaneously a mentor and a monitor.
Mhm.
So the sort of traditional sense of separation, sort of writing the exam and then marking the exam paper, is slightly breaking down, where it can become a more porous relationship, where the Global Chief Sustainability Officer might be sitting with the chair of the ESG committee, much more active working, and where the board is then a steward and an auditor of that commitment as well. So I think what we're seeing here is a sort of closer teamwork. And I think that is to be encouraged, obviously, without breaking down the formality of the governance process. But that's the way I think to accelerate the progress.
These were fantastic examples. Thank you so, so much, Vicky. You alluded to the point of teamwork. I mean, I have seen boards which are a fantastic team, and then I have seen boards which, well, they still need to invest the time to actually become that team. What have the boards you have seen who have achieved this? What have they done? What did they invest? What did they do in order to become that team that manages to do all of this?
Well, it goes without saying the chair is crucial. But in some of the more progressive boards that I've seen, the chair is sort of like the goat herder, leading from behind. I think what we're really seeing under the topic of climate is conventional change work. The climate and net zero agenda is really the most extraordinary change program that's ever been written, you know. And so, with all great change work, it is about having that powerful guiding coalition with a clear vision. And I think what I'd say is absolutely fundamental is the strategic ambition. And I'm talking about that in the context of the transition planning framework, the TPT framework, which is the result of that HM Treasury initiative that I mentioned earlier. And what that framework is really written down by experts, by leading and luminary thinkers that really know this stuff. What they've said is, here's how you do it, here's where you start. And that's across the board and the executive. Here are the questions that you need to ask and answer. Here's where the oversight is. So really, in the TPT work, a lot of the difficult, heavy lifting work has been done for us. So I do encourage everyone to use that. And what we've done at Chapter Zero is we've created a board toolkit that really refers back to that transition planning task force work that says, here's what you need to know from a board point of view. And our toolkit includes a briefing and then a scorecard. It looks at barriers and enablers and so on. And that's free to use and download from our website. And we really hope that will help boards get moving on this topic. But in a way, when I say to directors, look, you understand change, you understand innovation, or many of you do, this is no different. Then that sort of intimidation factor that we've spoken about, which is very human, and all of us feel that. I think fewer people are comfortable to say that, but it is my perception and what I've been hearing inside our discussions, even with very, very leading edge and experienced people. There's so much to learn. So we have to be comfortable with that, and we have to lean into that and not shy away.
I see the time flies when you're having fun, yeah? What are the 3 things our listeners should take away from this podcast?
So the first thing is there are only 2 scenarios for the future of our economies. We either invest in the clean economy or we don't. And if we don't, we will be in runaway climate change. This is fundamental to the board's remit. The second thing I would say is that a good transition is entirely linked with good governance. And so this has to be something that is led by the board, at least in terms of governance and oversight. The third point is that climate change and sustainability is an issue for the full board, even if you start with a narrower focus in the ESG committee. That ESG committee needs to report regularly and frequently into the full board, because this will transform business models and strategy over the longer term.
Vicky, fantastic. Thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Sabine.
How can we help you and your board? We at Better Boards are always delighted to hear from you. If you have an idea for a podcast, if you would like to have further information about what you learned today, or if you are interested in our work, get in touch. You can best reach us at info@better-boards.com. Thank you for listening.